Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Goddles and Pat Cummings. In a recent Pew Research survey, the majority of Americans believe the U.S. is one of the greatest countries in the world. Really now. Here are a few facts about America just about domestic and sexual violence. 1 in 5 girls were sexually molested as a child. 1 in 4 children were beaten by a parent to the point of a mark being left on their body. 1 out of 8 witnessed their mother being beaten or hit. 1/4 of us grew up with alcoholic relatives. And what about veterans? Researchers estimate that 30% of Vietnam War veterans have had PTSD in their lifetimes. So even though most Americans believe we are one of the greatest countries in the world, we appear to have a lot of violence, domestic abuse, and trauma. Let's discuss. Well, warm greetings. Greg and I are so excited to have Dr. Judith Herman on today, who I don't think I'm exaggerating, is probably one of our most prominent psychiatrists in her work with trauma and incest and post-traumatic stress. And Greg and I have been following your work. We've had a lot of vets on, people from the VA, and every time I mention your name, it's just like it's there. I'm talking about Mother Teresa. They love you so much. They've gone to your workshops. They know your work inside and out. So thank you for spending time with us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
And I like to talk about 2 books. I think this is kind of a bookend on your work, and I really don't think you can discuss your work without talking about both books. The first book was a book 20, 30 years ago, Trauma and Recovery, where you 1970s kind of took on the establishment psychiatric community on how people are dealing with trauma and recovery. And the second book, Truth and Repair, is just this last year, and that is extensive interviews with different patients that have suffered from trauma and what it is as far as treatment and recovery that makes a successful outcome. Let's start with your first book, and I'm so interested in what was going on in psychiatry back in 1970s when you were first starting, and how you developed some of your theories based on your work with women's consciousness groups and so forth.
Well, yes, I really owe it all to the women's liberation movement. I joined a consciousness raising group just a few months before I began my psychiatric residency in 1970. And my friend and classmate, who changed her name from Kathy Amatniak to Kathy Sarachild because she didn't want to be known by the patronymic. She'd been a civil rights worker during Freedom Summer in Mississippi. She was a SNCC volunteer. And she'd seen there, she'd participated in organizing what they called freedom schools. And she'd seen how powerful it was just to bring people together and to talk about what was really going on in their lives. And so she sort of translated that method, which she named consciousness raising, into the women's liberation movement. And she saw it partly as a method of organizing, but also as a method of scientific research, because she said, nobody really knows the truth about women's lives because women are afraid to talk about the truth of their lives, because they'll be shamed and blamed and for all the violence that is committed against them. And so it was really in these consciousness raising groups that both the prevalence of violence against women was first documented, and a social analysis came along with it that said this is a method of maintaining dominance of men over women. And so it was, a natural progression from consciousness raising groups to the first speak outs about rape and domestic violence, and then finally to scientific research about the prevalence of gender violence, which now is recognized by the United Nations as the most common human rights violation in the world. So I was right in the middle of that when I started my psychiatric residency. And my very first two patients I started on an inpatient unit, and both my first patients were women who had made very serious suicide attempts and been hospitalized. And both of them revealed histories of father-daughter incest. And it wasn't hard to make the connection between early introduction to the life of a sex object and their despair. Mm-hmm. And what do you know, when I actually listened to them and was compassionate instead of disbelieving and scornful, and they got better. And now, at that time, the comprehensive textbook of psychiatry, which was our basic go-to text, estimated the prevalence of all forms of incest at 1 case per million.
I want to stop you there. In preparation for you coming on, I did a quick Google search: father-daughter incest rates by country. I was just going to see various things. It returned a generative AI, artificial intelligence. Generative AI is experimental, so it gave you that notice. According to a 1964 survey, this is when you were beginning, incest behavior occurs in about 1 case per million in every civilized country. That was fact. Then they get it wrong again, with sibling relationships being the most common and father-daughter relationships being less reported. That was 15 minutes ago on iPhone search, and that's where that was the environment that you were at first practicing, and it was believed.
Well, because I'd been in the consciousness raising group. Now my group was a bunch of mostly Cliffies, white, upper middle class, highly educated, very privileged women. But even in that demographic, there was quite a bit of sexual, we didn't have these terms then, but sexual harassment and stalking and domestic violence and sexual assault. So I was ready to listen. And actually my first book, which came out in 1981, was called Father-Daughter Incest. I collaborated with a psychologist, Lisa Hirschman, who just finished her training. And between the two of us, we had no difficulty collecting 20 cases just from asking around among a few therapists we knew. Now, if 1 case per million was correct, how come 2 rookies could collect 20 cases in no time. You know, so so we published our first book in 1981, and in fact, the textbook of psychiatry was off by 4 orders of magnitude. It's more like around 1 in 100 for father-daughter incest. And of course, for child sexual abuse, I mean, eventually these books and speakouts led to some actual epidemiology research. And, you know, we now know that childhood sexual abuse affects roughly 1 in 5 to 1 in 4 girls. Boys are also abused mostly by men, but not nearly, you know, it's more like around 3% of boys. So that was that sort of set the course for my career. And then during the meantime, thanks to all the Vietnam vets against the war who had come back from Vietnam and thrown their medals over the White House fence and said, you know, we're back from Vietnam, but Vietnam is still, we're in us. We live in Vietnam. Our minds are in Vietnam. Every time we hear a car backfire, we duck under, you know, we hit the ground. And they were the ones really who got the American Psychiatric Association to recognize there was such a thing as PTSD. And that only became an official diagnosis in 1980.
Well, Greg and I had, Greg has a good friend who works as a nurse in the VA, and we interviewed Susan Gordon, Wounds of War, how the VA delivers health and healing. And it expressed that whole progression of the vets coming back and with their rap groups and sit-in groups, and they did the healing, and then kind of psychiatry picked up on the common themes and finally got it.
Yeah.
Got it right.
Rap groups were organized by Vietnam Veterans Against the War long before there was any kind of treatment in the VA. And my colleague, Robert J. Lifton, ran one of those rap groups and wrote a book called Home from the War, in which he described basically PTSD. And when they were basically consciousness racing groups. By the way, I think that so the wisdom came from the grassroots into the psychiatric profession from the bottom up. Then in the 1980s, we were starting a program at Cambridge City Hospital, which was a safety net public sector hospital, called the Victims of Violence Program for crime victims, and saw mostly women and survivors of gender violence. And meantime, my colleague Bessel van der Kolk was working at the VA and seeing combat veterans. And we got together and he started a study group on trauma, bringing together people who worked with different trauma populations. We had people who worked in a burn unit at Mass General, and people who worked with abused kids, and so on. And it became clear that trauma is trauma, and oppression is oppression, trauma is trauma, whether you're talking about war and political violence, and whether you're talking about gender-based violence in the private sphere. And so that was really the insight that that prompted me to write Trauma and Recovery, which came out in 1992.
I hate to keep hogging conversation. I'll bring Greg in a second, but the one of the stories in your book was I'm trained as I'm an MA psychologist. I'm a counselor and did school psychology and so forth. So
Uh-huh.
I'm at a general survey course level regarding this, but I certainly remember back in the 70s with Freud and his work, and read a lot of his work. And hysteria, which was a general term, catch-all term, Freud did a lot of work with that in 1896, and published a very cohesive, correct observation that early traumatic events in childhood are more than likely responsible for some of the pathology we're seeing in adults. That's just kind of a common thing. And in your book, you said that he was so proud of this that he thought this was almost the discovery of the Nile. I mean, he knew this was going to really take off. He was, Freud was generally a pretty brilliant guy. And every time I reread him, I realize how much I appreciate him. He published this, and what happened?
Oh, well, yes, he actually said he likened himself to a great explorer discovering the source of the Nile, which of course was going on right then. Um, if there had been Nobel Prizes then, I'm sure he would have thought he deserved one. But he was connecting hysteria, which was called the great neurosis. It was to childhood sexual abuse. And that was just unthinkable. And so instead of celebrating him, his colleagues totally ghosted him. And so he did a 180. He said, no, no, no. They fantasized about it. That was really the birth of the idea of the Oedipus complex. That this was just a fantasy because this is what all children desire. He didn't have any data on which to base this revision, this retraction. But then when he went on to, be a founder of psychoanalysis, this was one of the theoretical bases for it. And so, and it really took a century to undo that.
Greg, what are your thoughts? We've chatted so much about this. Greg and I have had probably an hour to an hour and a half conversations on your two books without you. What are your thoughts, Greg, about Dr. Herman's works and the importance of them?
I admire her work. I'm not as, I wasn't professionally engaged with therapy in the way both of you have been, so I'm a little bit of an outsider. However, I was a victim of sexual abuse as a child, so I have some particular anecdotal views about it. And I did a little studies in college of psychology. It was my minor, and I did a lot of classwork in it and did well. But I always thought what I admire most is that this notion, and Dr. Herman goes back to it, of talking it out, whether you call it conscious raising or rap group or whatever. But it reminded me of the Carl Rogers client-centered therapy that I really was fond of when I was an undergraduate student, reading about it. I think getting people to talk about issues is a critical door opener for what, and of course Freud too. I mean, Freud got people into a situation where they were comfortable, or if they weren't comfortable, he pulled it out of them. But I'm also struck by another question that's closer to my political framework, and that is most of this trauma, as I see it anecdotally portrayed, relates to power relationships.
Of course.
It goes back to the fact that certain people have power over other people. And I think just talking about your problem or my problem, my sexual abuse as a child, doesn't get you over that until you really go deeper and examine that it's not you.
Right.
Because you could take 3 vets that were in Vietnam in the same unit, the same experience. One will become a cop and beat people up. Another will learn to live with that experience, and a third will be tortured by it. And that goes to the fact that the one person can't understand the power relationships that are involved in the situation they were put into, they were forced into. And I think that's a critical factor. And I'm sure, I know you go into that. I mean, I know politically you're a kindred spirit in that regard, but I think it has to be really emphasized. I know in my own personal experience, I was abused by an orthodontist. I was in a chair. I was a
Mhm.
preteen, and I couldn't escape. I mean, I was in a situation, I couldn't talk to anyone. And it was the power of this person over me
Right.
that kept this thing going and disabled me in terms of being able to talk to anybody about it or addressing it. So I wonder to what extent you agree with me about the importance of power relationships
Oh,
and the trauma.
absolutely. Absolutely. I think, I mean, and when it comes to things like sexual violence or racial violence, this is one among many methods by which the power of the dominant group is maintained over the subordinate group. And that's why, in some ways, I came back to my third book, Truth and Repair, which is about how trauma survivors envision justice. Because if trauma results from an abuse of power, and interpersonal trauma always does, that's an injustice. And so full recovery is not just an individual matter. It's a social matter. It's a political matter. It's about not just what the perpetrator did, but what the bystanders did or didn't do. And it's about holding the perpetrator accountable. And so most recently, I went back to interview survivors. They weren't patients. That, you know, when you're in a relationship with a patient, it would be an abuse of power to invite them to be a research subject, because you have more power than they do. How are they supposed to say no? You know? So I just put, it's not a random sample. I just put the word out among my various networks that I was looking to talk with survivors about their visions of justice. And I chose survivors of gender violence because that's what I know best. And but I think it applies equally to any situation where the dominance of one group is over another group is deeply embedded in the culture, whether that's caste or religion or race, class. And I interviewed 30 people, 26 women and 4 men who'd been either sexually abused as kids, sexually assaulted, harassed, trafficked, or victims of intimate partner violence. And I just asked them, what would make things right for you? If you could write the script. About half of them had actually sought justice either in civil or criminal court. That's a much, much higher percentage than, I mean, basically maybe 20% of sexual assault victims report to police. And then it's an exponential decay curve from there. So, you know, most of these cases never see a courtroom.
Said
And
1% of rapists.
yeah, basically, I mean,
That's a horrible
if
statistic.
you're a rapist, your odds of getting away with it are about
Good. Are pretty good.
99 out of 100, unless you're a Black stranger, and your victim is a young white virgin, preferably blonde, and then the, you know, everybody will go all out. But if, you know, if it's, you know, a frat party, forget about it.
So, Greg, when you chatted briefly that you had reported this incident and that it was kind of common knowledge in this very small town that this person with great status and prominence was inappropriate. But
Yeah.
at a certain point in time, he got arrested and convicted and made to account. How did that, was that a powerful event in helping you finally recover from this, that singular event?
I hadn't thought about it, Pat, but it's a good question and an honest question. It brought great satisfaction to my aunt who raised me. I was raised by my aunt. She was like a mother to me. And finally, when I got to the point where I was able to talk to her about what had happened, she was the one that went on the rampage and wanted to see justice done. And so when I was in college, I think, when she sent me the clipping from the local paper about him getting arrested or indicted or whatever at the boys club. I mean, that's how audacious he got, because when you're not caught, you get bolder. It didn't do much for me at all, frankly. I mean, I moved on. Mine's a funny story, but I mean, I really didn't. But I was so happy it brought her a lot of, because she was a warrior. As a woman, she was a warrior. She went to war for me on many, many occasions. And to see her get satisfaction gave me a great deal of satisfaction.
Right. That can I kind of loop back to one more thing. Dr. Herman, when you first started to publish your thoughts about this, you published it in a psychiatric journal, and you said that it takes about a year for the journal to go through the process of being peer reviewed, and in the meantime, your article suggesting that there was much more prevalence of abuse than the psychiatric community thought went viral. You know, it was
There wasn't such a thing back then.
Yeah.
it was viral in Xerox machines. You know,
Yes.
it was, and that you were receiving so many supportive letters and correspondences and confirmations of what you were doing, the power of what you were doing. And this is Christy Blasey Ford.
Yes.
And she recently wrote a book about the Kavanaugh experience. And the reason she wrote the book is parallel to your situation. She received 100,000 pieces of correspondence, of which she's read 30,000 and responded to, of the victims that went through this. And this is the singular, powerful event that helped her heal. She doesn't want Kavanaugh thrown in jail. She doesn't want money. She just wants acknowledgments and justice. And that's exactly what you and your colleagues were finding when you really pulled the plug on what was going on with this. The parallels to me are very close.
Yes. Well, there's this, you know, anytime someone speaks out, one discovers that there are all those survivors out there who have been silenced, who are, you know, take courage from hearing this talked about publicly, and feel validated and understood and want to connect, because it brings people out of isolation. And I think, by the way, that's why the rap groups and the consciousness raising groups and the speak outs were so effective, was because they brought people together.
I called a friend of mine who's a VA vet, a counselor, probably one of the more important therapists in PTSD. And of course, he has your picture up in his office or whatever. I mean, he just loves you. And I recounted how you said in your book two things. You can't do therapy with this population alone. You need a group. And the group, to truly heal, after you becomes, they become safe and they can kind of retell their story. And there's certainly therapeutic processes that help with that, that the VA's done a good job. You also can't heal without a group. And when I asked him about that, I said, where do you think she's right with that? And he said, we would take our patients to the baseball game. We'd take them on bike ride. We would set up as many events as we could to allow them to develop a therapeutic community. And he said, you were absolutely right. It is impossible to have a trauma victim come into a psychiatrist and just in isolation heal. It has to be done socially. And that's a prominent theme in your book also, that this is a social event. Well, not event, but tell me about that. Is that?
Well, I think what trauma does is to shame and isolate people. And that's the intent. That's how you disempower people. You don't just intimidate them, you shame them and you isolate them. And so the healing involves reconnection, bringing people together, bringing people out of isolation. And in order to do that, we need our own buddies. We need our own support system, because, we develop a certain kind of secondary traumatic stress just by witnessing these horrors. I mean, there are things, you think you've heard it all, and then a patient will tell you something that you just couldn't, in your wildest imagination, think one human being would do to another human being. And, it just makes you want to throw up. And so you need a shoulder to cry on. You need someone to, cry with and laugh with and tell you you're not alone. And I think we're social beings, and so that goes for all of us.
I'd like to ask you about, like I said, I'm old enough that I remember going through all the various versions of the DSM and so forth. And you literally kind of wrote the book on PTSD, as far as in the psychiatric community, you chaired where you initially got that diagnosis codified into the DSM. I don't know, was it 3 or 4 that it came in? Was it 1980?
PTSD was 1980, DSM-3, yeah.
DSM-3. And my question is you were working in collaboration with the vets, and then you were also doing all of your work with the incidents of both sexual abuse and various other early trauma. Do you think that you could have got the diagnosis without the collaborating with the vets? Because maybe is it sexist to think that if a vet finally comes out and says, I mean, was there a male female a power dynamic that when you got together you were stronger as together than you were as the separate parts?
No, it was, I mean, realistically, it was the vets who put it on the map. I wasn't involved in that, or, in that phase of raising awareness in psychiatry. It was the vets who did it. And I think you're right, it's not sexist to say it, but nobody denied they'd been to war, right? Whatever else, they could be, I mean, they were shamed certainly for, well, if you were a real tough man, you wouldn't be suffering, because, what are you, some kind of wimp? And by the way, that still is a big obstacle for vets to get treatment because they don't want to admit weakness. And with our forever wars, we've had enormous amount of PTSD, and a lot of the people who need the treatment most don't get it because they don't come, they don't seek it because they feel, they would be, people would think less of them, they would be disrespected. So yeah, but however much shame is involved, at least they couldn't be told, you made this all up. This is a fantasy. Everybody knew they'd been to war. That was a documented fact. With women, it was sort of like he said, she said, right? Oh, well, we all know how women lie about this, right? Or they fantasize about it because it's what they really, really want. So, and there weren't, most of the cases, there aren't witnesses, although in a surprising number there are. And these days, with frat parties, there's often, video evidence. But so, yeah, I mean, one of the contributions, I think, of trauma and recovery was to basically say, you know what? Trauma is trauma, whether you're a man or woman, and, rape and combat are initiation rites into the violence at the heart of our society. Only there are war memorials to combat vets, and there are no memorials to rape victims. Of course, now there is a memorial to rape victims because a survivor actually got one built, a woman named Sarah Super, who'd been raped at knife point by an ex-boyfriend who broke into an apartment to punish her for breaking up with him. And she's another one who she pressed charge, the police were called, he was taken into custody. She did go forward with with a criminal complaint. He was convicted. But she came forward in the newspaper to identify herself as the victim. And she got letters from all over Minneapolis. And so she actually decided that there should be a memorial for rape survivors, and she got one built.
Greg, you're just a little bit older than me, and you are in the cohort where you had a lot of colleagues, friends, buddies that went to combat. I mean, to me, it was older brothers. I literally was right at the cutoff where the draft quit. So I did. Did you ever? I mean, you saw a lot of difficulty of these people adjusting, coming back to the town. And did you see people go the other way, actually get treatment and end up having good functional lives because they did have good psychiatric intervention? Or did you just see the other side of it where they were continued to have difficulty functioning due to the horrible things they went through in combat?
Well, as Dr. Herman emphasizes, it's all about context. And in my era in the 60s, it wasn't just the soldiers that were traumatized. It was those of us that didn't want to go that were traumatized too. It's hard to capture the whole flavor of that. But to the point you make, one of my best buds now I work out with every day, same age as I am. He took a different road. He joined the Marines and went to Vietnam, and he came back and he found had an unhealthy relationship with alcohol, screwed up relationships. He got a fast car, the fastest car he could afford, and drove it right on everybody's bumper. And he panicked inside of tunnels in Pittsburgh, where I live. There are a lot of tunnels, and I mean, you can go on and on. He'll tell stories about just the fiber of his life being insane because of what he experienced, but he couldn't talk to anybody about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And back to the point that Dr. Herman made earlier, the opportunity to VA was not in the best of situations. It was not in an encounter group or anything. It was just individual one-on-one with a bad psychiatrist, a bad one, but the opportunity to talk and having a circle of friends outside of the VA who also were supportive, myself included, and getting that, it really helped enormously. I mean, it turned his life around. So, which points to makes a point, and that is, in our era and before, social organizations, groups, institutions existed in far more abundance than they do today. I pity a person coming back from Iraq, or a young woman faced with sexual aggression today, when our society is so individualized. So in my view, most of my problems were solved out of my network of friends. Most of my trauma was dealt with in my network of friends. I mean, they were available to me. I was very social. But for so many people today, it's not there. It's just not there.
Tell me what happened with the. I was looking at the change of the Victims of Violence program closed after 38 years. You established this program in Cambridge, um, seminal program, won all kinds of awards. And I get the feeling right around COVID that it closed down. What went on with that program?
Oh, it is a sad story, but unfortunately it's not an unusual story given the state of mental health care in our country now. Uh, we we started in 1984 with a grant of $6,000 from the Cambridge City Council to establish mental health services for crime victims. And we grew and grew. And we were an outpatient program. We did lots and lots of therapy groups, trauma groups, support groups. We trained a couple hundred people over the years in psychiatry, psychology, social work. We did some good research. We did some good community interventions with, things like after the marathon bombing and so on. And by the way, we had a model where you don't just parachute some experts in, but you cultivate community agencies, alliances with community agencies, and you train them to be interveners. And then if somebody approaches you and asks, after there's been a shooting in a school or some such thing, you deputize some of the people from that community who've been trained, and they work with the people who made the request to craft their own intervention. And you want to leave that community more organized and more capable of advocacy than when you found it. So it's a community organizing model. It's not a ask the expert model. So yeah, we grew and grew, and And then what began to happen was psychiatry became more and more and more of a money loser, because basically third-party payers don't want to pay for it. I mean, the medical insurance model in general is one and done. They pay for procedures, you know. So my stepson, who when he was in medical school, he said the acronym among the students was that the road to happiness was radiology, ophthalmology, anesthesiology, and dermatology, because you know you lots of money for procedures, and you know you don't see chronic patients. You do something, and you know if you know you do a procedure and you get well reimbursed, and you have a happy, grateful patient. But taking care of people where you need to establish a long-term relationship, as in psychiatry, pediatrics, primary care, where you're going to see a lot of chronic illness, no, those are the money losers, and psychiatry most of all. And so our hospital has been hemorrhaging money, and their solution has been to try to treat more and more patients with fewer and fewer staff, and to hire, we now, in my psychiatry department, we have, if you please, a vice president for psychiatry operations, who's an MBA.
Oh my God.
And he reports not to the man who is now not called a medical director, but a CEO. So you have the corporatization of healthcare, and nowhere has that been more destructive than in psychiatry. And you know, this is why the biggest providers of psychiatric care to people with chronic mental illness now are the prisons in LA, Chicago, and New York. And so that's the state of mental health care, and that's the state of our safety net hospitals. And so at a certain point, and so we've been hemorrhaging staff, because it puts the staff in a position of moral injury to be required to deliver inadequate care.
Right.
Care they know to be inadequate. And so they'd rather be in private practice, where at least they can call the shots, and deliver decent care, even if it means they're not going to see the people who need the care most. So that's the state of our mental health system. I have to tell you this. I have a colleague, Frank Putnam, absolutely brilliant researcher, clinician, policy guy, was at National Institute of Mental Health for many years. He has survived for many years now with stage 4 prostate cancer. And he and I talk regularly on the phone about stage 4 capitalism and what it has done to healthcare. I mean, with hedge funds buying up hospitals, what do you expect? So we closed the program because we were on life support, and we were not able to function.
My mother-in-law just went into an assisted living facility, and the care there was horrible. And I discovered that it used to be wonderful 4 years ago, until it was bought by BlackRock, a hedge fund, and they cut the staff in half.
Right, they stripped the assets,
Stripped the staff.
you know,
And if you'll know,
That's the business model.
yeah, and if you'll notice, Joe Biden had a law passed last spring that there should be minimum staffing requirements for nursing homes and assisted living facilities. And if you watch cable TV at night, one of the most repeated running commercials is the big hedge fund people that are saying this is just too much. We're going to have to be closing down facilities because we can't adjust to this model. I don't know. Don't get Greg going on this.
I appreciated this last. I have to clip this last section about the state of
stage 4
mental health care and send it to my daughter, who is a social psychologist. And we have this conversation all the time about her frustration because she cares. And her mother, my wife, who's passed away, was a social worker. And she was not driven out of the field, but almost, because it became monetized. And now my daughter has a gig where she's going to deal with people over the internet. And I said, it's crazy. She said, well, I'm escaping my own hell, by doing this. What are your thoughts about this internet mental health treatment, where for a few bucks, you can go online and have a psychiatrist, psychologist talk to you? Does that make any sense?
Well, it during COVID, a lot of people moved to virtual because they had to.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I have been surprised. I was very suspicious about it. And that's not the right word, but I had a lot of questions in my mind about whether that would be effective. And I was surprised, actually, at how many people took to it. Not only for one-on-one, but actually, I have colleagues who've run groups online during COVID because, again, how are you going to have a group? And have been pleasantly surprised by the results. It's not the same as being in the room with a person, but for some patients, as long as they have some place where they can have some privacy at home, and as long as they do have internet access, and of course those are two big caveats, because with our population, a lot of people don't have that. And some of our patients even, they went out into the hallway of their building or something to try to get a private place. But they don't have to travel, which for some people was a big obstacle. And they do have, it does allow a certain amount of access for people who otherwise wouldn't have it.
Rural and isolated.
And so in some ways, I think, we don't yet have a lot of good data, systematic data about the effectiveness, but I've been pleasantly surprised.
I work with a nonprofit that works in public schools, and just 6 months ago went in and talked to a principal about their staffing problems, teachers and so forth, and discovered that their social workers and psychologists are all done remotely because they can't get staff. And I said, well, how does that work? And they have Zoom meetings, they record it, they do it all done remotely. She said, otherwise we wouldn't have mental health services. We wouldn't have them if we didn't have this model. So,
because of the state of the field, the mental health workforce is a fraction of what it needs to be.
Exactly.
And so this is a force multiplier, if you will.
Well, I hate to take up too much of your time, but I want to just end on one kind of common thing that I think all three of us would agree. I was reading an article in preparation for this because you were talking about how the changes in services occurred with deinstitutionalization. And I came across a Salon article of 2013, Ronald Reagan's Shameful Legacy, Violence, the
Yes,
Homeless, Mental Illness. And,
absolutely.
and it
Absolutely.
just, Greg and I could sit around and talk for hours about how horrible he was in putting into motion this neoliberalism that has just destroyed so many things. But here's something that I did not know. President Ronald Reagan never understood mental illness. Like Richard Nixon, he was a product of Southern California culture that associated psychiatry with communism.
Yes,
And I thought that, Greg's, I guess,
because there were so many Jews.
oh, it was the Jews that was
Yes,
the thing. Oh, the Oppenheimers and your mother to a certain extent was
yes, yes, indeed. I
impacted
am
by
a
the,
red diaper baby.
Oh, are you
Um,
now? Good for you.
oh yes, I'm a proud red diaper baby.
oh my
Um,
gosh.
um, but no, I mean the joke used to be, "What is a psychiatrist?" Question, answer: a Jewish doctor who can't stand the sight of blood. Uh,
I haven't heard that one.
Talk
yeah,
about compacting a lot of stereotypes into one little bundle.
no, but I came of age during the deinstitutionalization era. Kennedy,
Me too.
who did care about mental illness. There was all this federal money. Once we had the antipsychotic meds, the argument was these patients could be cared for much more humanely and also less expensively in their communities instead of warehoused in big asylums, and so I trained in one of those big asylums, Boston State Hospital, and then I saw those same patients who had been, pacing the wards and mumbling and rocking. I was hired to be part of a day treatment program, with a spectrum of community-based services, including community residences and day treatment and partial hospitalization, that were developed in the 70s for this same population of patients living in the community residences. And the idea was that all the money that went, the federal government would provide seed money, and then the states would close the state hospitals and divert that budget to the community-based services. But mental patients don't exactly have a strong lobby. So the hospitals closed, the money went elsewhere. The states never funded the community-based services. And when Ronald Reagan came in, that was the end of the federal money. And that's when we started having homeless people on the streets. We didn't have homeless people on the streets when I was coming up. We had a small skid row for people with end-stage alcoholism. And there were maybe half a dozen people on Skid Row, up to 20 maybe. There weren't hundreds and thousands of people on the street or in prison with severe mental illness. And whatever you want to say about the state hospitals, and they were prison-like and they smelled bad, but they were not prisons to the same degree. And people got their 3 hots and a cot, and they got some degree of medical care. And the old timers, could work in the, the snack bar, or they had a library, for God's sakes. And so yes, thank you, Ronald Reagan.
Oh, he was horrible. Well, I remember talking to psychiatrists that were, when the Thorazine and some of the other medications came through, they just thought it was, life changing of how they could get a little more control over some of the horrible behaviors. And obviously they're better than nothing, but without treatment, without support, it isn't, you can't just medically manage mental
They're
illness.
necessary, but not sufficient.
And we had on Dr. Moncrief. Do you know Joanna Moncrief, the psychiatrist from London, that is kind of going after the pharmaceutical industry for overprescribing the SRIs and all of the antidepressants? And that's her exact same thing. She says these medications are fine. They have a place, but you just can't medically treat depression by having someone come in and get a prescription. You can't do it.
And
it's the same.
It's not penicillin.
Yes. Oh goodness.
And we have great study. We have lots and lots and lots of data that show that for severe depression, a combination of antidepressants and psychotherapy is more effective than either alone.
Right.
So that's the kind of good, but most psychiatrists don't even practice psychotherapy anymore because you have to go through so many insurance hassles.
Right.
And it's just, you have to hire a whole other staff person just to deal with the insurance companies. Whereas if you just write scripts every 15 minutes, nobody bothers you.
I had a friend with horrible depression and couldn't get him a psychiatrist, and he's wealthy and he has money and he's got he eventually had a bad outcome. But there may be in Tacoma two psychiatrists that are taking patients, and there it's primarily just medical. It's no one's seeing patients. I don't know. Okay, that's a bummer. That's a bad note to end on. So
Will.
You just, Dr. Herman, you are just it's so nice to talk to so many of my friends and counselors. And when I mentioned that I might be getting you on my program, their happiness, their affection for you is legitimate and well-deserved. And I think that's, you've had a wonderful career. Are you doing any private work? Are you consulting or doing anything?
No, I don't have private practice anymore, but I'm still teaching.
Oh, you're still teaching?
Yeah, Harvard has a nice deal. You give them 3 free hours of, supervision for the residents and so on, and the postdocs, and you get your library card. So,
nice.
it's not to like.
Any final thoughts, Greg?
Well, I enjoyed this. I enjoyed this very much. This was very enlightening, and again, you're right. Our admiration for your work is just beyond speaking. So, it's been a delight. Thank you.
Thank you. I've enjoyed our conversation. Take care.